The following is part of Cornell Contemporary China Initiative Lecture Series under the Cornell East Asia program. The arguments and viewpoints of this talk belong solely to the speaker. We hope you enjoy. And I will remind you all this is the final lecture in this semester's series of CCCI lectures, but all indications are we'll be back next fall, full speed. So not the last ever. So we're very happy to have with us a speaker, Adam Chau, who comes to us on a long path from all over. So Adam was born and raised in his young years in Beijing, but at about the age of 12, moved to Hong Kong, then came to the United States where he did his undergraduate and graduate degrees, and finished his PhD in anthropology at Stanford in 2001. After a short time here teaching, then took his current position, which is in the Department of East Asian Studies at Cambridge University, where he teaches about modern Chinese popular religion and anthropology. So very sort of multicultural, and you've spent more time in the States than any of those other places, is that right? So sort of equally at home everywhere you go. In 2006, published his first book, Miraculous Response, if I got it right, a book on popular Chinese religion, mostly based on fieldwork in northern Shanxi province. And then will speak to us tonight not about intervening work, including a new book project, but even newer stuff, some very brand new research he's doing, and has alerted me to an outreach goal. Is that right? So if there is one thing you take away from tonight's talk, it might be this: to not ask specialists like himself how many religions there are in China or what's the most popular religion in China, but rather to ask how is religion practiced in China? What do they do? I think is the focus of your work, right? What do people actually do? So I guess we'll hear something about what people do. So please join me in welcoming Adam Chau.
Thank you so much, Robin, for the invitation and for the introduction. And it's such a great honor to be here at Cornell, sharing my work. I have a slight cold, so if there's some cough and sneezing, my apologies. So the larger goal about asking how people in China do religion, or actually how people anywhere do religion rather than what is your religion, that's a much wider outreach goal. But this afternoon I will be speaking about one current project which I wanted to be collaborative in the future, which is on the construction and operations of the religion sphere and other related spheres in China. And from this project, not only to understand the state-society relationship in China through the lens of religion, but also to understand social transformation in Chinese society in the past 100 years or so. And you will see, I will first give a historical overview, and you'll see how actually the concept of sphere came to China about 110, 120 years ago. And thank you all for coming in such a sunny day to come inside for this talk. So in recent years, the Chinese Communist Party is contemplating allowing some people from the religion sphere to join the Chinese Communist Party. But this is a very strange proposition because, as you know, if you join the Communist Party, one of the requirements is that you have to be an atheist. Yeah? So by definition, it's a contradiction. But the party is seriously contemplating this. It's not just a casual thought or proposition. So you can see in the Chinese phrase, to allow certain leaders of the religion sphere, the elite of the religion sphere, into the party. And in a recent meeting for the United Front department of the CCP, President Xi Jinping spoke about religion work. Yeah? to these people who are in charge of administrating religious policies in China. So you have 4 points. The fourth is 必须重视发挥宗教界人士作用. We must try, or you must try, the United Front people, to make good use of people, especially leaders, in the religion sphere. Yeah? So you have an approach to the religion sphere that's very functional to make good use of their contributions to building socialism in this new era. And if you read the Chinese newspapers or official media, you would have come across such categories. Officially, there's the zongjiaojie, religion sphere. Underneath, you have Buddhism sphere, Taoism sphere, Protestantism sphere, the Catholicism sphere, Islam sphere, minority nationalities religion sphere, and very recently, even popular religion sphere. It's actually, I made a mistake here, it should be 民间信仰界, because in the mainland, 民间宗教 refers to sectarian religion, which is actually still highly illegal. So that's 民间信仰界. So you will see that in the recent People's Congress, or including the People's Consultative Committee, Consultative Committee meeting, you have the top leaders of these separate subspheres of the religions. Right? So Catholicism, Banchan, Tibetan Buddhism, and then Xuecheng Fashi, the head of the Buddhism Association, and then a head imam, and then a Taoist priest. Yeah. So, in fact, you can see this kind of a socialist multi-faith dialogue. Yeah. They are brought together to study official state and Communist Party documents, but at the same time, they also exchange often their view on everything in society. So the title is 宗教界大咖, the big shots of the religion sphere coming together. In this photo, you have the religion work people. So as I mentioned, the United Front department is in charge of uniting non-Communist Party segments of society around the party for the goals of socialism. So these people are typically party members, and they're in charge of encountering and administrating and registering religious institutions. So this is a 培训班 training program. I don't know if you can see the slides well. Again, these are pictures of 宗教界 leaders, people of a particular city, of a particular province. They are brought together from all different subspheres, Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, Catholicism, and Protestantism, to discuss matters of concern, especially to study the current ever-changing policies in relation to religion. Yeah, these are also 培训班 pictures. This one is an interesting one. Each person has a plaque in front of him or her stating how much money this sphere has donated to a particular cause. So it's a little blurred. These are from the internet. So the state wants to make good use of the religion sphere, including financial donations and other donations and assistance for disaster relief or for other charitable causes. Just a few years ago, when singing Maoist-era revolutionary songs was a very popular pastime for a lot of Chinese people, especially retirees, these people who had gone through the Maoist era and spent their youth singing these songs. Now they're retiring, they're in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and they're really into singing these revolutionary songs as part of their nostalgia, right? But it is a little strange, and you may say awkward, to see members of the religion sphere, or Buddhist nuns, Buddhist monks, Catholic priests, or Catholic nuns singing so-called red song, revolutionary songs, right? But this is 2011, right? To commemorate the party's founding, the 90th anniversary of the party's founding. So in other words, you can see people of the religion sphere have been mobilized to help the cause of whatever is on the agenda of the state. Right? Hong Kong's religion sphere, altogether. So, for example, in 2008, we have donations from the religion sphere. Buddhism sphere donated 200 million Chinese dollars. This is only within a half month of the Wenchuan earthquake in Sichuan. Taoism, 40 million. Islam, 24 million. Catholicism sphere, 100 million. Protestantism sphere, 120 million. You might wonder how they arrived at these figures, because in fact, these churches, mosques, temples, and monasteries were collecting funds for disaster relief. And they have these statistics to show how clued in they are to the state's requirement and how willing they are to help these causes. So then I would propose a preliminary definition of jie, which is the focus of our presentation today. A jie sphere is a political instrument with which the state interpolates different segments of society. Interpolation is a concept from Althusser and Foucault. So to call them into being, make them into a real existing community so that you can better control, manage, and utilize them. But is it a overly state-centric definition? So using the concept of the zongjiaojie, I want to do a few things. One is to look at the historical emergence and operations of the zongjiaojie. Second, using this as a window to look at the emergence of all kinds of jie. So I'm not just interested in the religion sphere, but in fact, broader societal transformations, especially during times of radical social transformation. I'm talking about especially the time of the transition from dynastic China to Republican era and the Reform era, these two periods of history in China that see the most vibrant actions of civil society, but also very interesting movements on the part of the state. So I propose a sort of like a sphere studies, 界的研究, to help us better understand state-society relations in general in the Chinese context, but also maybe in other places. One key concept is public, a public. How do you form a publicly visible and a group of people that are acting in public, and what kind of impact they will have on society? So there's a sort of both a specific goal to understand religion in China, but also a much broader goal to understand social transformation. The concept of jie originally came from, well, obviously there were Chinese indigenous usages about boundary and a piece of land marked by this boundary. But in later usages in Chinese, it's heavily influenced by Buddhism. So jie is actually a concept of of this realm of a universe of sorts. And so the concept of 世界, 世 refers to a temporal aspect and 界 refers to a spatial aspect. But later on in modern language, 世界 refers, of course, to the world, which is a 20th century usage. So we have all these terms available in English to translate 界, and I have chosen sphere as the most appropriate for the moment. In the past, I have used sector, but there are a lot of theories in sociology, political science, and policy studies about sectors. So I just want to be different or to try not to confuse people with this usage. So I think sphere is the most appropriate. But public is also a really good sort of contender as a translation. In the transition from Manchu Qing China, so we are talking about 1911, so more than 100 years ago, this transition to a new nation state of the Republican era in the 19-teens and 1920s, we had the most transformative period in Chinese history. Right? So we're talking about post-Taiping Rebellion, post-Boxers, the suppression of the Boxers, and losing the war, the first Sino-Japanese war to Japan, and encountering all sorts of encroachments by Western imperialist and colonialist powers. So in this atmosphere of disintegration of the Manchu Qing Empire, you had more autonomy for the different regions, different provinces. So different provinces began to assert their regional power, but also more trans-local and trans-regional organizing among the elite. In this particular period, you have to remember in 1905, the civil service exam, the 科举 exam, was abolished. Right? So all of a sudden, you have these literally millions of Chinese literati at all levels losing the foundation of their livelihood and aspiration. So these people were highly educated, they were literate, but suddenly no more jobs, no more aspirations. You had to learn the 新学, like new Western learning. Right? Everything you learned about Confucian classics became useless. So it's a radical period of change. The translation of Western books into Chinese, hundreds and hundreds of these. Many were done in China indigenously, but some were also translated via Japanese. Say the original would be in German, French, English, or whatever languages. And then all these Chinese people who studied in Japan during that time translated through the Japanese translations into Chinese. So the introduction of the modern printing press in the treaty ports was one of the most crucial elements in forming associational life that went beyond the local. Right? So in the past, you had poetry clubs formed by literati of a particular town or village or county, but never beyond a radius of 50 or 60 miles. But now you have the printing press, and suddenly you could reach people of similar interest in faraway places, right? In this new nation. And writing changed. Modern Chinese writing came into being, replacing the old literary style. In this milieu of radical societal change, you have the emergence of all kinds of spheres. So this is only a very partial list. Yeah? So you have 学界. So we are all in the 学界, right? The students and professors, we're all in the 学界. 政界, politics sphere. 司法界, the law and judicial sphere, 金融界, finances, 商界, business people, 军界, military, 民界, ordinary people, 女界, which is a very interesting concept. Before, in the past, women were domestic, right? They were confined to the homes. They never entered public life. But now, women entered public life not only as, for example, students, but also as writers, as translators, as society women, as beauties in magazines. So you have the first modern celebrity culture in China. So women came into public life in a major way, forming 女界. Later it was changed to 妇女界. Publishing, education, 留学界. Yeah, at that time, thousands were sent to America. Well, some to Cornell in the very beginning, but also later, because it's too expensive, they sent many more to Japan, and they formed their 留学界. Yeah, I don't think 留学界exists today, even though we have hundreds of thousands of 留学生 from China. Industries, literary, arts, diplomacy, police, judicial again, officials, entertainment performers, newspapers, news. 省界 is specific to particular provinces and dialects. 业界, particular trade. The reformers sphere and those conservatives, 守旧界. And 青年界, youth. And then 思想界, thinking people's sphere. And of course, for our purpose, 宗教界, etc. This is, as I said, a very partial list, including, of course, some of the most important ones. There are many, many more. 宗教界 as a concept, the religion sphere, came from Japan. During the Meiji era and the Taisho era, the Japanese were already speaking about the religion sphere. There was even a magazine called 宗教界 in Japan. But in China, the first mentions of 宗教界 were around the beginning of the 20th century. So one of these articles is called 论中国宗教界之缺点, speaking about the weaknesses of China's religion sphere. Literally, well, so 界 as a suffix came to China via Japan, even though it's a Chinese character. Of course, so in Japan you would call it a kanji, but the Japanese were at that time making up thousands and thousands of new words using Chinese characters, and they were conveniently borrowed by the Chinese thinkers, not only those who studied Japan, but also those who read these translations back in China. So people like Mao Zedong and those people who never went abroad were fully exposed to thoughts and translations during that period, including these 界-related new words. So Lydia Liu, of course, has written about translingual practices, the borrowing of these new concepts from the West and via Japan. The Fudan historian Zhang Qing also has written about the rise of the 思想界 during the transition from dynastic China to a republican era. There are many other suffixes that are like ubiquitous today, right? 什么什么阶级, 什么什么主义, 什么什么话, 什么什么性, 什么什么学, 什么什么论. All these about something ology, 论, or some studies of, 什么什么学. These are magazines from Japan about different 界 in the Japanese usage, including one for us, 僧界, monks sphere, which in China was picked up by Buddhist reformers like Taixu at the same time. Majuejie is a very strange thing. I don't know if it's really about mahjong, but it might have been. So the sphere of mahjong players. So why did people at that time want to form these jie, right? It is when, during this transition, the old order was destroyed, right? The old order based on literati connections, based on civil service exam, based on appointment by the court, based on old divisions of people in the empire, were all destroyed. Now we have a new nation state that needed these new communities of people filling it up. Right? And at that time, there was a crisis for a lot of people. I mentioned these millions of people, literati, who lost their jobs and their aspiration, because the lowest level literati were teaching the Confucian classics to young people, right? Because they did not have the good fortune of getting an official appointment. Those were the most numerous and most in crisis. And in this transition, most of them found something very interesting to do, including spirit writing, including becoming a ritualist for funerals, including, of course, not all of them could embrace new learning because they were too old or too conservative in their outlook. But many of them were involved in a cause, finding a cause and reaching out to people to help you support your cause. And that's when people named spheres, named a jie, to pretty much form a community of like-minded people in their attempt to achieve their goals. As I already mentioned, modern printing press was really important in this particular endeavor. So newspapers, magazines, and intrasphere newsletters all became the medium through which these messages and causes were propagated and understood. Because don't underestimate the difficulty of understanding these new terms and new causes. Right? Like, what do you mean we need to, be behind certain ideology, right? Certain 主义. What's this 主义? It all takes time for everybody to learn. So each jie was an imagined community. We are familiar with Benedict Anderson's expression. So as the Chinese were imagining this new nation, they were simultaneously, or they were aided by the imagination of these spheres, right? Suddenly, you belong to a sphere. Suddenly, you are told you should belong to a sphere, right? And then you pretty much your new subjectivity was being formed. Rather, instead of being the subject of the empire, of the dynastic China, now you're a citizen of the new republic, and you are a member of a particular sphere, whether it's 学界, 女界, 实业界, it doesn't matter. So you are, of course, you can simultaneously belong to several spheres if you're an elite of some standing. So in other words, these spheres were useful to help people imagine this new nation. It's not just, there's new China, there's 民国, and then you just imagine the 民国, right? No, you have to do all kinds of imaginations, and the imaginations of the sphere really helped this transition period. And I would say that each sphere was imagined to be spatially coextensive, isomorphic, coextensive with the boundaries of the new nation. So 宗教界 is China's 宗教界, 女界 is China's 女界, There's a co-construction of the nation and these spheres. And I give you a really brief example of how the Protestantism sphere formed. In 1906, the Presbyterian pastor Yuet and his colleagues formed 中国耶稣教自立会, translated as the China Christian Independent Church. And that's really one of the first time. This is only 6 years after the Boxers' Rebellion's suppression. So the Christians finally regained their confidence and strength, and what they were but we're still in the Manchu era, right? The last emperor. So just a few years later, in 1910, they decided, so this newly formed China Christian Independent Church, Yu Guozhen decided with his colleagues to make a beautiful set of the New Testament and to give it as a present to the emperor. This is not the first time the Bible was given to the emperor. So just 20 years earlier, or maybe just 10 years earlier, Cixi Taihou, the Emperor Dowager, received a copy of the new, really beautifully set Chinese translation of the New Testament. Right? So in the statement, even though he never mentioned the word 基督教界, it didn't exist as a term yet, the Protestantism sphere, but the concept was already there. He was representing 260,000 Protestants in China and abroad. But note the usage. 华侨, yes, 本国耶稣教徒, these countries. Foreign Protestants are not part of this concept. 260,000 Chinese Protestants elected me as representative to present this Bible to you, to the emperor. So this you can see a kind of self-electing, because there was no process of election, of course. How would you know that 260,000 Protestants elected him? Right? But there was a self-electing, and this is also the process of forming the jie. You need leaders for these jie. A lot of times these leaders are self-appointed. Same happened to Buddhism and Taoism. As you know, in the late Qing, there was the movement to use temple, monastery income or land or buildings to help found schools. So a lot of temples were facing this crisis, and so both Buddhism and Taoist or both Buddhist and Taoist elites were worried about massive loss of their influence in this transition. So you have the founding of all kinds of national level or local level Buddhist or Taoist associations. Right. So this process formed the Taoism sphere or the Buddhism sphere, and the concept of 佛教界, 道教界 also were bandied about at that time. So you saw the list of many spheres. This is how China began to be imagined as, if you have taken anthropology classes, you would have heard of structural functionalism. So China is imagined as this sort of like an organism where you have all these functional structural parts. Each, we can call them a sphere, interacting with each other and then performing the work of perpetuating this polity. Even though the language of functionalism was not really explicit at that time, but the concept, the idea, or the implications were all there. So earlier we had the preliminary definition of jie, right, as a political tool for the state to call people from society into being and control them and all that. But now I suggest a revised definition. So a jie is a tool, a social technology for elite members of society to construct and mobilize different communities in society. We might call them constituencies, to carve out domains of resources, material and symbolic, as well as a hierarchy of accessibility to these resources. You might think this is a bit too cynical, yeah? But we don't need to feel that way, because in fact, all social actions need initiators and elite. So this is a okay, good definition. So in order to form a sphere, you have to have principles of inclusion and exclusion. Who deserve to be in this jie? Yeah? Who are definitely not part of the jie? Yeah? Some are easy to say, yeah, 女界, 男界, that's pretty easy. But there are certain things like 宗教界. A lot of people in this process were excluded from 宗教界. Local ritualists who were performing funerals or exorcism or other ritual services, they were not considered part of the 宗教界 because they were too lowly. Their form of engagement with religion was too practical. Yeah. So at the same time, you have this new concept of religion coming to China based on Christianity or Abrahamic religious models. So all these religious practices that did not conform to those models were seen as not deserving of the label 宗教. That's why you have 迷信, yeah, superstition, or even like magic or things like that. So the Buddhist reformer Taixu was the most vehement in denouncing these so-called 应付僧, monks who just perform funerals when somebody calls upon them. 应付僧. So he proposed the Buddhist reform, especially of 僧戒. You see this concept of the monastic sphere. And if you're a real monastic, right, not counting all these Buddhist ritualists performing funerals, if you're a real monastic, you also need to conduct yourself in a particular way so that you become a deserving member of the 宗教界. And at that time, lay Buddhism also became really important. A lot of supporters of Buddhism who were not monks and nuns, but were major patrons of Taixu's reform, especially behind, for example, the printing of sutras and other Buddhist texts. I won't talk about this much, but if you become a member of a jie now, so we're talking about 100 years ago, yeah, you are no longer a private person. Anything you do in public has an impact, not just on your family, your community of village or county circles, but on this jie that you belong to. Right? So if you are a major figure in the 教育界, if there's a scandal, the whole of 教育界gets a negative rep, right? So this is a process of private persons being made into public persons, thus forming this broader public. But this revised definition about being a social technology, yeah, for elite members to form a community, is this a little bit too society-centric? Earlier we have a more state-centric definition. Now we have a society-centric definition. What if this sort of incredible social energy, yeah, in the transition from dynastic China to Republican era, or in the reform era, from high Maoism to reform era, what if this social energy encounters a meddling state, or even an authoritarian state? So, and that's exactly what happened during this period. Let's see, what time is 5:13? I have 10 or 15 minutes. Okay, right. Time really flies. So during the High Maoist era, all societal initiatives were eliminated. In fact, all the foundation of any initiative was eliminated. Lineages, native place associations, private enterprises. So you can say that at that time, during the High Maoist era in the 50s and 60s, spheres really did not exist. Right? So there's a suppression of any societal initiative. More important categories like 人民 or 革命群众 replaced the spheres. I will not spend time on this. But in the reform period, as I mentioned, this is the second time in modern Chinese history when social energy was released and there's a vibrant civil society, at least in certain form. Right? All these spheres that previously existed, most of them came back. 宗教界 became really vibrant. People began to form their own agendas in relation to their 界, negotiating with the state. Right? So I'll give you a few weird, strange spheres. Yeah, 个体户界, private entrepreneurs sphere. 保姆界, domestic helpers sphere. 电竞界, online gaming sphere. Charity sphere, volunteering sphere, women's movement sphere. Yeah, these are all actually existing spheres. Yeah. As I said, all you need to do is to have an idea, name that community behind the idea, and that's a 界. Whether the concept catches on or not depends on your luck and social support. If a lot of people are behind your cause, that 界, that concept will stick and become prevalent. Gurus sphere, rich kids sphere, yeah, 富二代界, 屌丝界, 网红界, internet celebrity sphere, and 同志界. Yeah? Of course, you know, 同志, comrade, was pilfered from communist usage by the gay community in China. And so now they call this sphere 同志界, which of course the state will never identify and allow or use, right? So a lot of these 界 are at the stage of transitioning into proper recognition. 家庭教会界, 海归界, 土豪界, 汉服界. So unlike 宗教界, which the state takes seriously and interacts seriously, there are some of these spheres the state doesn't care very much about, at least for now. Yeah. So, but if it becomes a real social movement behind this 界 concept, then the state has to engage and maybe transform or even try to eliminate. So I try to give a 2x2 sort of a quadrant matrix to characterize the relationship between state and society. Yeah? So weak society, weak state, no spheres. Yeah? Weak society, strong state, no spheres. So this is the High Maoist period. Strong society, weak state, a lot of spheres. So this is an early transition from dynastic China to Republican era. The state at that time was very weak. So a lot of spheres. And then strong state, strong society. This is the reform period. The state is very strong, but it's more of a paternalistic regulatory state that allows a lot of spheres to exist and to be created, but has a very strong hand in managing, controlling those that really matter to the state agenda. Right? So religion sphere, 宗教界, is one of these that's being managed very carefully. I already mentioned the structural functionalist components. So now we have one preliminary definition, one revised definition, and this is the sort of a combined definition. Right? A jie is a socio-political domain in which and with which the public political presence, legitimacy, and utility of China's various communities are made manifest and negotiated. So I think that comes closest to what jie is about in my analysis, combining both the statist perspective and the elite formation perspective. I will only have a few minutes, so I will give a quick overview of the rise and fall of the Qigong jie. In the 80s and 90s, you had a Qigong fever in China. So these are different kinds of methods to manipulate the flow of qi in your body in sync with the cosmos, and then to enhance your vitality and your health, and even to cure illnesses, sometimes long distance. So they were actually literally thousands of different kind of qigong methods or gongfa in China at that time. The scholar David Palmer has written a book, Qigong Fever, on this topic. And so at that time, people were coming out of this really restricted environment of the high Maoist era of being confined to a particular locale because of the hukou system and the liang piao, 什么票, the coupon system, and suddenly people could move around very much. This was also the same time when the pyramid scheme, 传销 fever was going on. Like literally hundreds of millions of Chinese were going up and down the country, either attending 传销 pyramid scheme classes or learning new Qigong methods. Yeah? So there are different entry points for a lot of these Qigong methods. So suddenly you had a Qigong jie in formation with, probably half of the country belonging to it. Yeah? You have scientists doing experiments on it, detractors saying it's all fraud, and then supporters who write biographies or hagiographies of grand masters of Qigong. So this is a very important part. The sphere is not just constructed by people who belong to it. A sphere is also really importantly constructed by people who are discursively speaking about it, either in support or against this sphere. Yeah? So if you continue writing articles against a particular sphere, you are helping to construct it, even if negatively. And even people who are excluded by the jie, they are part of the construction of that jie as well, because they are negatively being excluded. So I will not speak too much about the Qigong thing, but the one lesson from this particular case is that Qigong jie at that time was so important that it did not need to gain cover under medicine sphere or sports sphere or religion sphere. At that time in the 80s, religion sphere was really feeble. So Qigong jie was actually the most popular and important sphere in town. I think from there you will see that after the crackdown of the 1998 of most of the Qigong denominations, the entire Qigong jie pretty much disappeared. Yeah? There are still acceptable Qigong methods that's approved by the state, but you don't really hear anybody talking about the Qigong jie anymore. Yeah? As if suddenly half of China's population just didn't belong to the Qigong jie anymore because it's gone. Yeah? So you can see jie came and went. Yeah? And then there are a lot of jies that will never be allowed to form, even if you have the interest to call it a jie. Yeah? No one would allow the existence of, say, 邪教界, evil cult sphere, or reactionary sectarian sphere, 反动会教门 sphere. 家庭教会界 actually exists as a concept. So I Googled it and it actually exists. But the state, of course, will never allow it in state-approved media. So all negative social categories cannot gain the status of jie. I will not have time for this. Popular religious temples, they try to gain access to either Taoist or Buddhist sphere, sometimes successfully. So for example, this Black Dragon King temple I studied in Shanbei, they managed to gain access to be registered as a Taoist temple. Yeah. However, the temple boss or his successor would never be really considered part of the zongjiaojie because they were still too lowly no matter how popular the temple was or is, they are not discursively adept to engage with religious sphere properly. Yeah. So these are just some pictures from the Black Dragon King Temple festival. There'll be just a couple minutes and I will conclude. Now they do have a few Taoists at the Black Dragon King Temple, but they are mostly just paraded out in the annual temple festival rather than being treated as anything serious to add to the temple. And of course they have a 中国梦, China Dream umbrella in the procession. Because most of the activities are still considered superstition in legal terms. For example, giving out curing water, exorcism for children, and things like that. Right? But it's immensely popular locally and well received by the local state agencies as well. This is pretty much a protection ritual for small children and dispensing talismans. I'll just jump to the very last point about legitimation, because after all, I tried to lure you to this talk by asking you to think of the religious sphere as a most awkward sphere. Please note that it's not the most awkward sphere, it's a most awkward sphere. And it's all about legitimacy, right? There are spheres that are 100% legitimate. For example, 教育界. Nobody will have any problem with that. But 宗教界, it's awkward because its legitimacy was only granted reluctantly by the state, who's now, I think, agreeing that it's inevitable that there will be people who are following some religions in China. And it's not only inevitable, but there's a very large number of them. Yeah, only very recently they gave an official statistics on how many Buddhists, how many Taoists, and how many Muslim and how many Protestants and Catholics. Obviously, as I said, it's really inappropriate sometimes to think of Chinese religious practices as based on confessional identities. So any statistics on how many Buddhists or Taoists there are in China is not going to be very useful. Right. So the religion sphere is a most awkward sphere because of all these reasons, that there are so many religious practices that are not in the religion sphere. Some want to be included, some don't even care to be included. Yeah? So the ritualist I mentioned, for every member of the accepted religion sphere, say for example a Buddhist monk, there will be 100 ritualists performing funerals in the countryside, spirit mediums performing exorcism and healing, and diviners and healers. So these people would never be considered part of the zongjiaojie. And so if the state continues to be led by this kind of modernist confessional understanding of religious identity. Yeah? So you have to say you're a Buddhist, you're a Taoist, or you're a Muslim. Then they will never actually capture or gain a real understanding of the religious practices or situation in China. Right? So that also makes the concept of religion sphere awkward, because it's actually an inaccurate understanding of what China is all about. Right? And lastly, religious organizations are never content to stay in the confine of religion sphere. They always spill out. So I call this a restlessness syndrome. Right? They want to spill out into education, but the state does not allow them. They want to spill out into charity. The state allows. There's the annual 宗教慈善周 or something like that. The charities week for religions, as if you can just sort of confine religious giving to 1 week of the year. They want to spill out into environmentalism or sports or other kind of spheres, but the state wants them to be confined to religion sphere. Right? So all of these reasons make the religion sphere a very interesting and very awkward sphere. One last point is, remember the 2x2 table. If the strong state retreats, then you have a situation similar to the early Republican period, where different spheres can come into being and operate more by their own logic. Then religion sphere might become a religion commons, with many more interesting logics informing the operations of the religion sphere, whereas now it's a rather limited range. So some questions: do spheres always originate in society? Yeah. Do the state sometimes make up spheres? I don't know of any particular examples. And lastly, 界 is more than just a suffix. It's such a fertile concept for us to understand state-society relations and social transformation. And I hope it's not just in China, but we can help using the Chinese case study to see if a similar kind of analysis can be carried out for Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, or any other, especially post-socialist countries. And I think I've spoken quite enough. So I really welcome your comments and questions. Thank you very much.